Joining me right now for an in-depth discussion on this issue, political commentator Pat Buchanan, also a former senior advisor to President Nixon and Reagan. Mr. Buchanan, as always, it's a pleasure to speak with you, sir.
Good to talk with you.
All right, well, first off, what do you make of the House bill and what went down on Friday before everybody took off for the recess?
Well, I think what happened basically was that the Republican Party, feeling it couldn't go home without doing anything, enacted a couple of bills which are going nowhere. And I think the objective was very probably to be able to tell the people back home that we tried, and Obama's responsible for the fact that there's no reform on the border, there's no security on the border, that the problem has not been dealt with. But I think the Republicans should be aware that without going into the issue of the children on the border, I think he's prepared to issue an executive order giving de facto amnesty to 5 to 8 million illegal aliens.
Well, let me ask you about something you wrote in your recent column. I'm quoting you here. Among Republicans, a roar would arise from the base to impeach Obama. This, if he does what you say he might do, no matter the consequences. But while impeachment would divide Republicans, a Democratic call to arms would save the first black president from impeachment and would unite his own party and bring the money rolling in here. So where do we stand? We heard from my colleague John Gizzi saying that he highly doubts the president would do anything. So there is, I guess, uncertainty about what the president may or may not do here, but there would be consequences if he does take an executive order on amnesty.
Well, it would be a firestorm unlike any we've seen on this issue, and it would elevate it dramatically and make it the issue for the fall campaign. Now, I think that would clearly rally and energize Obama's base, but it would do the same for the Republicans. There would be, as I mentioned, a real firestorm. There would be a division of opinion. Some editorial writers would say, who are friendly to Obama, say he's gone too far here. So he might draw back from doing it. But let me say this, if the Republicans gain in the Senate and the president realizes he's going to get nothing from the next Congress, zero, I think there's a possibility he could do it after the election. But I am sure that in the White House they are talking over this as a big and historic move which will weld the Hispanic vote to the Democratic Party forever. So I think those who say there's no chance he will do it, I think they ought to hedge their bets a bit.
And so, Pat, you're thinking that maybe somewhere in the White House there are some folks saying that this might be the last best chance for the White House, the Democrats, to do something shocking, perhaps maybe a little bit radical, to really drive out voters, the Democratic voters, and get them to the polls.
I think that's right. I think there's no doubt that the La Raza and the left wing of the Democratic Party and many folks in the Hispanic community would say that Obama's done something dramatic for us. He really has. We ought to get out and vote. So I think that's a real possibility, but it's clearly a very risky strategy. But it's also bold, and it would be historic whether we like it or not. And it's something that Obama might want as his legacy. But he also doesn't want to lose the elections badly in November. So I think some of his folks are going to be saying, look, this will get out the Republican base like nothing else. And many of our candidates down there in Kentucky and in Louisiana, especially in the red states, could be into the ground by this, and they would have to come out against it. It's a huge, big play, no question about it, but I cannot believe that in the White House they are not thinking of it. I know if I were in the White House and I were a liberal Democrat, I would certainly be analyzing the potential fallout from such a decision.
And that would be the biggest October surprise in quite a long time. I know you also mentioned Teddy Roosevelt in your recent column. We want to get to him real quickly before we talk about your Nixon book here. But does the Republican Party need a populist president like Roosevelt was to really address this immigration issue, in your opinion?
Well, I think the Republican Party has been, look, I raised this issue in 1991 when it was called to my attention by Duncan Hunter when I was running against President Bush, the first President Bush, and it seemed the solution was quite obvious. You had 5,000 people walking into your home from one part of Mexico into this sort of poor section of the United States right there at the San Diego border, and we clearly needed a security fence on the border. You can't have people walking into your country. And so I made that case, and I just wondered why the Bush family did not seize upon it, and it's an issue of national security. They're breaking our laws. They're breaking into the country. And why they didn't seize upon it and say, look, we're going to secure the border. It's a winning issue. In those days, it was overwhelmingly a winning issue. I did fairly well in the southern counties of California, even though my campaign was finished by then. And I don't know why they didn't do it, but as a consequence of the failures of the Republican Party when they had both houses of Congress and the presidency to deal with this crisis, I think it has now become a national crisis that they're unable to deal with because they don't have the presidency.
All right. Well, Pat, I also want to get to your book real quick. Let's take a look at that book, The Greatest Comeback, How Richard Nixon Rose to Defeat and Create the New Majority. I want to play for you a piece of tape that started circulating back in 2012, but has now been in the news recently. It's a conversation between Nixon and a young freshman senator. Let's take a listen.
Senator, I know this is a very tragic day for you, but I wanted you to know that all of us here at the White House were thinking about you and praying for you, and also for your two children. You can remember that she was there when you won a great victory, and you enjoyed it together, and now I'm sure that she'll be watching you from now on. Good luck to you. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Well, there was President Nixon talking to then Senator Joe Biden about a tough time in his life, losing his wife and his kids there in a car accident. Now, you knew a side of Nixon that a lot of folks don't remember. You highlight in your book, but we're learning more about Nixon as a man. Pat, just leave us with a quick story, something else that you remember, a softer side of Nixon.
Well, when his mother died, I was down at the office, and I was surprised Nixon came down to the office before he went to the airport to go to California for the burial. And he called me in and basically wanted to talk to me generally not about that issue of his mother's death, but about other issues. And then at the same time, Rose Woods, his secretary, both of her parents died, and she was just distraught.
Yes.
And I was in that little office, and he called her in.
Well, Pat, I'm sorry. I've got to cut it off here. We're out of time, unfortunately. But you know that side of Nixon. A lot of folks can read more about it in your book. We're back here with more on America's Forum.